thank you all very much for being here tonight. This is a part of the Volkswagen Group Art for All series, which means that there's free entry to the exhibition, and I hope some of you took advantage of that today. And today we have the great pleasure of extending that with some scholarly heft. And we have a real icon of the field here, and not just an icon, but also one of the creators or co-creators of the field. So Jonathan Katz is an art historian, a curator, and an activist, and he's currently the professor of this I have to read, the professor of practice in art history and gender, sexuality, and women's studies at the University of Pennsylvania. But apart from titles and appointments, he's also one of the figures who created the whole idea of queer art history happening in academia, often against all odds, against some resistances, and with great resilience. And we wouldn't be here without him in many ways. He's an author of many books and articles, and also he curated what is one of the first major museums exhibitions on queer art as such. It was called Hide and Seek, Difference and Desire in American Portraiture at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery. And again, a lot of what we're doing here today probably wouldn't be possible without shows like this. He is the first full-time American academic to be tenured in what was then called Lesbian and Gay Studies at City College of San Francisco. And he also then founded the Yale University's Lesbian and Gay Studies program, which was the first such program in the Ivy League. He is also an activist. He co-founded Queer Nation San Francisco, and he co-founded the Gay and Lesbian Town Meeting, the organization that successfully lobbied for queer anti-discrimination statutes in the city of Chicago. So it turns out you can be an academic and an activist and don't have to lock yourself into a tower of ivory or other materials and still write brilliant scholarship. He's the president emeritus of the Leslie Lohman Museum for Queer Art in New York, and he's currently planning more exhibitions. One of those exhibitions, which I think I'm allowed to say, is called The First Homosexuals, which is the first survey of art that was produced right after the coinage of the word homosexual, and it will start in Chicago in 2025, or its full iteration will start there. And it will then travel on an international tour with some possible stops not too far from here. And with that, I would like to ask you to join me in welcoming Jonathan Katz.
Thank you. That's very sweet. Thank you so much. That was a really sweet introduction. I appreciate that. All right, let's get into it. I like censorship. It illuminates the law, the codification of what one is permitted to know or see or feel. For this reason, I count contemporary incidents of censorship as a form of paradoxical political progress. For such incidents finally make visible the weight of the authoritative control we have been seeking to contest in the first place. But there's another kind of censorship that is so successful it doesn't have a name. It too eliminates, expunges, or erases history, but does so perfectly that nothing is left to testify to what was once there. Unlike censorship, it's transparent and visible in its contemptuous, censorious intent. It is thus a mistake to think that queer history has been censored, when in truth, it has been purged, eradicated, redacted. This invisible erasure is by definition an imposed silencing that has been transformed into an absence. And only very rarely does this process reverse itself. But in the case of Warhol, it has. Andy Warhol's interview in What is Pop Art, and I'm showing it to you, part of the famous series of interviews conducted by Gene Swenson in 1963, is the source of some of the most famous Warhol quotes of all time. But as a superb doctoral student at the University of Chicago named Jen Sitchell has argued in her recent groundbreaking article in the Oxford Art Journal, we've had a notably skewed relationship to what Warhol actually said. Jen has managed to find and transcribe the original interview with Swenson, which she discovered in the form of scratchy cassette tapes stashed away in a box among Swenson's papers privately held by his friend ever since his tragic death in a car accident in the summer of 1969. Jen published the excerpts from the tapes in her March 2018 article entitled, "Do You Think Pop Art's Queer? Gene Swenson and Andy Warhol?" And I'm entirely indebted to her transcription of these ostensibly lost tapes. As I'm about to demonstrate, through the discovery of these tapes, we can literally resuscitate ideas that were deliberately excised from this defining early interview. It's after all here that Warhol famously says for the first time, "I think everybody should be a machine. I think everybody should like everybody." These are indispensable utterances that have, over the years, sustained much of the critical argumentation over Warhol's practice, pop art, and indeed postmodernism in general. But the interview was recut by the magazine's editors so that in its published form, every single reference to homosexuality or queerness was ruthlessly edited out. No wonder, as you'll shortly see, Warhol can sound a bit incoherent. The published transcripts spliced together different conversations into a false whole. With the discovery of the unedited tapes, we now have a perfect instance of the deep connection between Warhol's homosexuality and his aesthetics. Warhol clearly wanted his thoughts on sexuality to be recorded, but the prejudices of that day left those thoughts on the cutting room floor. When I published a little book on queer Warhol in 1993, I speculated on the valence of his queerness to his art. But with the discovery of the original interview, we now have what even the most traditional of art historians must acknowledge as evidence, spoken, moreover, as you're about to hear, in Warhol's own voice. It's hard to understand him, so I'm going to transcribe the tape, but you will also hear it momentarily. We pick him up here at the beginning, and as you'll see, the tape literally opens with the direct question, "What do you say about homosexuals?" But immediately, Swenson and Warhol's friend and assistant, Gerard Malanga, reframe the question in the arch-ironic terms of then-contemporary gay speech, turning into a kind of campy critique of the super-masculine abstract expressionists. Listen as Warhol and company turn the painter Norman Bloom into Norma, Michael Goldberg into Michelle, and Ivan Karp into Eva, all notably macho art world types. As you'll see, Warhol at first happily plays along, but I want to call your attention to that rare non-affirmation in Warhol's speech, a brief "no, I'm." It's the beginning of an objection to the familiar way they're playing with sexuality, and he will, as you'll soon see, revisit and amplify this extremely rare negation into something that becomes the fulcrum of this entire talk. Here he is.
What do you say about homosexuals? Oh, you guys actually read the first one. You know a lot of things were homosexuals. Were homosexuals? Yes. Who are they? Who are these girls? No, Michelle Goldberg? Really? Who else? Now, Leslie? Norma Bloom. Norma Bloom? Eva Cup. Eva Cup. How about, no. Thank you. Yeah.
Jen's discovery of the unedited interview reveals that in 1963, questions of sexuality were hardly incidental to the discourse on pop, but front and center, and deliberately so, since, as Warhol says a bit later on, in response to Swenson's indignation over the homophobia in the art world, quote, "I think the whole interview on me should just be on homosexuality." Swenson, then a critic, writer, and curator beginning his career in the New York art world, had reason to believe that this particular line of inquiry would receive a warm reception from Warhol, because that same year, Warhol completed a series of drawings, erotically tinged, of course, of the critic, concentrating on his sensuous lips and tongue. But what makes this recovery of a silenced history itself so queer is that in contrast to the expunged archival record, Warhol's actual work, his paintings, publications, performances, persona, worked overtime to make visible his queerness. And yet somehow this extensive queer visual archive, with the notable exception of his films and this very exhibition, has largely escaped inscription as such, until the discovery of this tape rewrote the equation as if somehow the pictorial evidence that we kept seeing was inconclusive. Though I am certainly addressing the lost tapes, I do so in fear of what this elevation of the discursive implies about art historians' credence in our own eyes and our own methods. It's not like you can miss the heart at the tip of his penis, right? Warhol's early softcore images of young men, mostly lovers or would-be lovers, are, again, with the rare exception of this show, rarely seen today. Oh, goodness. Forgot to do that. Again, this making this work and this exhibition exceptional. This is especially the case with his more hardcore images. Sorry, that was the previous one, but we're not going to see it. Why is this not moving? Thank you. Especially with hardcore imagery from an enormous series of cock drawings, cock portraits he called them, that he ostensibly completed for his proposed cock book. At the Nationalgalerie in 1956, Warhol even proposed an exhibition of boys kissing with that very title. It was a remarkably bold political move in the mid-1950s, and Warhol was surely not surprised when the exhibition was rejected, not least because the gallery boasted the very straight Dutch-American abstract expressionist William de Kooning on its board of directors. But that Warhol proposed such an exhibition, at once defiant, politicized, and boldly dissident, at a time when homosexuality was quite literally against the law, is telling. Not least because this was over a decade before any national queer civil rights movement was born. The consistent inattention to the homoeroticism of this early work, in contrast to the over-attention to his queer persona, has offered what is at best a skewed picture of Warhol. But the roots of what Warhol would become can still be traced to this moment, as is beautifully exemplified by this 1956 drawing, which would be recycled in 1969 into the famous Warhol cover for the Rolling Stones album Sticky Fingers. Hardly marginal, this album was the one that rocketed the Stones from popular to legendary. Unlike today's homophobic elisions, uncomfortable silences, and studied omissions, at the time his art was new, Warhol's sexuality was generally the very first thing anybody said anything about him, and often the first thing he said about himself. In a 1962 radio interview, accompanied by his friend, the Met curator Henry Geldzahler, Pop Warhol responded seemingly at random with yes or no to non-yes or no questions. Gelthaler helpfully added, quote, that when Mr. Warhol says yes, he means no, and when he says no, he means no. The exasperated interviewer then thanked Mr. Warhol towards ending the entire fiasco of an interview, and Andy finally piped up with this in a studied, very feminine voice, "That's Miss Warhol." When his art was new, Warhol's queerness was not only mentioned, it was thematized. It was credited with determining the course and direction of his work, made over into his defining motive and purpose. How Warhol framed his queerness, and in turn how he was framed by it, is my theme today. In so doing, we'll find that contrary to expectation, Warhol's queerness was actually more forthrightly acknowledged earlier in his career than it would be later. And secondly, that Warhol's early success was widely understood by him and by others as directly related to his sexuality. But as Warhol's fame rose along with his prices, sexuality dropped out of the equation. Or better said, it was transformed into mere biographical fact, severed by a wide gulf from the high-value commodity that was his art. As an aspect of simple biography, sexuality is generally given no more purchase on his art than the fact that Warhol was born in Pittsburgh. Yet addressing Warhol's queerness brings to bear important historical nuances, for I'm going to be arguing that there's no less than 3 distinct modes of queerness visible in Warhol's work. The first 2 we readily recognize. One features these homoerotic images of young men, conforming to cultural expectations of what a gay art should look like. And it was singularly unsuccessful in circulating beyond the relatively small clique of gay men, more or less, who found such imagery enticing. Another model of gayness on offer, not nearly so inward-turning and insular, instead addressed itself to dominant culture. Indeed, manifested its queer bona fides only through reference to the non-queer world. I'm showing you, of course, Marilyn Monroe's lips. This, too, is a familiar mode of gayness, subjecting dominant culture to a judgmental queer eye and a withering tongue, elevating discernment and taste as its weapons. Camp, of course, is its primary mode, the recognition that what passes for the natural in our culture is, in fact, a social construct, a semiotic of the natural, as evidenced by Monroe's lips. This latter model is in many respects the obverse of the real earnestness of Warhol's male nudes. It's instead arch, excessive, and ironic, the very definition of camp. And unlike that other mode, it's a subcultural formation that not only promotes an engagement with dominant culture, but speaks in the language of dominant culture, referencing its codes, all the while critiquing it and internalizing its standards. I trust I don't need to belabor the point about why a faggy kid like Andy Warhol might find a certain pleasure in revealing the ostensibly natural category of gender as instead an artifact of the social. The third model of queerness in Warhol is the most elusive, largely because it violates the defining norms of gayness as a product of subcultural identity and social difference. This last mode, it is what is finally made plain in the recovered interview, but it has been evidenced in his art all along, hiding in plain sight. That this anti-identity vision of queerness wars with his more particularly erotic and camp gay modalities shouldn't concern us. After all, he was exploring the contradictory faces of queerness over a decade before our familiar battle lines were drawn in the aftermath of Stonewall's riots. The very earliest works by Warhol, in his nascent pop style, can be seen as a transition from his previously recognizably gay model of minority erotics, such as the boy drawing, to this other more dialectical camp and queer mode. Any serious engagement with Warhol's art has to make sense of this pop mode. It's, after all, what made him arguably the most famous artist of the last half of the 20th century. And yet, it's been notably resistant to queer readings. Warhol's earliest pop works all display the hallmarks of camp, which is to say, an emphasis on the construction of the ostensibly natural. Here's his quotation from the back page of a comic book featuring a familiarly Warholian homoerotic shirtless male with the truncated tongue-in-cheek description, strong arms and broads, the result of erasing the word shoulders. Below it, the partial text suggestively reads, should hands and fingers, as it approaches his torso, the whole summarized as anti-New York. An ironic take on the ostensibly natural category of masculinity, Warhol here deploys a vaguely gestural field to broaden the work's target range. In his advertisements from 1960, that camp bodybuilder is joined by a series of other commodified undercuttings of the category of what is constituted as natural, including everything from an advertisement for a man's toupee to a nose job to a rupture illustration that is humorously, unnaturally sexless. Wigs then follows a similar plan, composed entirely of artifice parading as natural. That it was painted as he chose his own hairpiece, as the nose job image coincided with his visit to a dermatologist about his rosacea, is relevant but not self-evident, nor was it intended to be. Rather than cataloging the construction of the natural, how we actively fashion what we claim to automatically already be, Warhol's queerness was instead written in and through this process of selection and citation. But the question of how and why Warhol's art switched from either markers of subculture, as in his male nudes, or from camp quotation to this third mode, a wholesale embrace of popular culture, and I'm showing you here 210 Coke bottles, has not been fully explored nor explained. The value of that switch for his art is self-evident. It made Warhol Warhol. But what led up to this changeover and how it was understood at the time is still largely unexplored. In what follows, I will try to illustrate how a turn to the archive can rewrite one of the world's most often exhibited artists, explaining Warhol's abandonment of a manifestly gay art in favor of what would become his much more queer pop mode. That archive is not only his recently recorded interview, but also a careful reading of the social history of this time. That the switch coincided with his move towards silkscreening is germane, but outside of my topic. Suffice it only to note how the move away from the autographic towards mechanical reproduction indexes a very different sense of authoriality, less manifestly subjective and more a reflection of a larger social context. So in 1958, 4 years before Warhol's first pop exhibition, the important American art critic Harold Rosenberg described and analyzed what he defined as a newly emerging tendency in American art in his introductory essay to an exhibition he curated and tellingly entitled Audience as Subject. In this important but understudied essay, Rosenberg offers one of the earliest accounts of what today we would call postmodernism, an art alive to and able to theorize the fact that it is being looked at by an audience. As Rosenberg wrote in that essay, instead of concentrating on art, its problems, and its needs, the artist now speaks to the audience about itself. His image lurks on the wall of the gallery as a disguised mirror, end quote. Let me be clear here that Warhol was not included in Audience as Subject in 1958. But by the early 1960s, his art was being discussed as exactly such a mirror of the audience. In fact, in his autobiography, Warhol would famously construct not just his art, but even himself as a mirror. In one of his famous epigrams, he wrote, "People are always calling me a mirror, and if a mirror looks into a mirror, what is there to see?" Less than a year later, in 1959, in an article called Death in the Wilderness, Rosenberg had decidedly rethought and nuanced his account of an art that mirrored and integrated the process of its mediation, of its interpretation. In that article, surface and reflection now emerge as the defining trope of American life. As he put it in the article, and I'm quoting him, "American life is a billboard. Individual life in the US takes place and includes something nameless in the weeds behind it," end quote. Americans have become, he argues, walking billboards, public advertisements for a way of life carefully composed to be seen but rarely authentic to innermost thoughts and feelings. To be American, Rosenberg wrote, is thus inherently performative. To compose your face, to conform, to echo and reflect dominant social and political ideologies. In this, Rosenberg, like a lot of left intellectuals, actually had an axe to grind. In an America only newly emerging from the hysterical McCarthyite anti-communism of the early 1950s, a superficial but nonetheless carefully policed conformity held sway. After all, the same year that Rosenberg wrote Death in the Wilderness, California dictated a law that said that you had to swear that you were not now nor ever had been a member of the Communist Party in order to secure a fishing license in Oakland, California. In this context, it's hardly surprising to argue that American life was a billboard and nameless things took place in the weeds behind it. My point, though, is this, that 4 years before Warhol's emergence as a pop artist, Rosenberg has made his bed already for him. Death in the Wilderness described an artist who had not yet come to the fore, but who was going to be powerfully distinct from the abstract expressionists of the previous generation. The new art would not be an expression of the artist's own subjectivity. Rather, it would be about the audience and how they saw and understood themselves. He had prophesied the emergence of a new art that made the terms of its interpretation of how to read and understand its significance now the central problem. Rosenberg's diagnosis of American life as inherently conformist and superficial, as a disguised mirror of popular culture, is of course a strikingly avant-la-lettre definition of what would become years hence pop art. And even more remarkably, Rosenberg would not only predict the development of pop, he would precociously deploy its defining term, a term that would come to characterize pop before pop even really emerged. That term is camp. As Rosenberg wrote in the same piece, you quote, "You cannot fit into American life these days except as a camp," end quote. A full 5 years before Susan Sontag's vastly more celebrated Notes on Camp, Harold Rosenberg harks the emergence of camp as a social and political force, lending it significant explanatory power. As he continued in the same article, quote, "A good deal of the conservatism of the present generation is ancestor camping. That is a deadpan takeoff on life with grandpa. In camp, the masquerade becomes the real thing." Rosenberg, end quote. Rosenberg thus countered the horror of conservative Cold War culture through the good offices of camp. In the country's outward obeisance to conservative norms and values at the close of the 1950s, Rosenberg argued that the younger generation was in fact marking their distance from traditional norms, their performance of life with grandpa. Now, let's be clear. Surely to argue, as Rosenberg does here, that the oppressive conformity of the American Cold War 1950s was a kind of put-on would surely have come as news to those other Rosenbergs, Ethel and Julius, who were fried in this electric chair for their trumped-up treason. But it is, I think, symptomatic of a major shift in intellectual currents that begins here and directly informs the development and reception both of pop and Warhol. As the era's deadly serious politics of anti-communist red baiting began to fade, its worst excesses began to be seen, weirdly, in terms of playful campiness, as if the only way to explain McCarthyism and its horrors was to remake it as a kind of ironic joke on what it was to be an American, super patriotic, super conformist. This was Americanness denaturalized, desacralized, converted into an echo of itself. Rosenberg's precocious articulation of the centrality of Camp's denaturalization to America's self-image even included an astonishingly forceful articulation of Camp's own particular queer genealogy. Unusually for this period, the mid-1950s, Rosenberg directly points to homosexuals as responsible for much of the period's camp energy, writing, and I quote, "Just how much play acting there is in this is indicated by the enthusiastic participation of the homosexuals in the new reconstructed family movement. Indeed, fairies and near fairies are in the vanguard of our new domesticity." It couldn't be clearer. Because Rosenberg understands American life as a billboard designed to hide the real life taking place behind it, he also understands homosexuality in an indicative relationship to American identity at large, because it is thematizing its promotion of a split self, a performatively divided public and private identity as endemic to American life in general. And furthermore, that split self traffics in camp, in the denaturalization of the ostensibly natural, as a means of mobilizing its recognition of its own inauthenticity. There we have it. In 1959, the homosexual is now constituted as the model American, precisely because the homosexual is the widely established embodiment of a self-consciously constructed identity that's built for public consumption, and thus is inherently performative. At the end of one of the most homophobic decades in American history, a decade in which more queers lost their livelihoods and many their lives than in any other, the split subjectivity of the camouflage queer had become the very model of American subjectivity at large. No wonder then, but that a few short years later, starting in 1962, Warhol would begin a series of portraits of similarly split American subjects. Here is Jackie Kennedy, for example, in the week before and after the president's assassination. In the first part, the very image of smiling charm. In the second one, the emblem of a stoic private grief. Elizabeth Taylor, on the set of Cleopatra, then the most expensive movie ever made, which did much to solidify the feeling that the once innocent ingenue wasn't so innocent any longer. He even first began to paint Marilyn Monroe only the week of her death, which was more or less a suicide, an act that underscored how her gilded life was more cage than stage. In these and in so many other works, Warhol literalizes the notion of a split or bifurcated identity, sometimes as here, even using black and white and color reproduction to underscore this divide. These celebrated split subjects make manifest the degree to which the public-private division, rather than being a specific and special property of the homosexual, was now rather, as Rosenberg argued, indicative of all American life. In once selecting such loaded subject matter and then carefully calibrating or balancing his representation so as to avoid imputing any narrative or authorial intention, Warhol, of course, flirted with the accusation that he had no feelings, since no legible emotion seems to animate these choices. Worse, there was a sneaking suspicion that his motives were not altogether pure in his representation of human suffering, that a whiff of ironic detachment motivated his art. But rather than being put off by the accusation that his work was indifferent, impersonal, or mechanical, Warhol instead cultivated the notion that he aspired to be like a machine. Early critics even conflated his homosexuality with the work's mechanical quality as a silk-screened image, arguing implicitly that queers and machines share a quality of passivity born of the absence of will, and were thus, for all their activity, submissive subjects not in control of their own destiny. For example, in an unpublished 1962 interview, The critic Rudolf Arnheim, and I particularly love this because I'm now the Arnheim professor at Humboldt University, complained about the dominance of women in American family life and how the U.S.'s woman-centered society, that's his quote, has made American boys much weaker than their European counterparts. Such a train of thought seems to inevitably lead Arnheim to consider the dominance of homosexual artists in the post-abstract expressionist art world, and I'll pick him up here, speculating on the impact of Warhol. I quote, "You can say that an art form that is characterized by the surrender of creativity, where the most characteristic thing is that I take passively from the world in which I live and that I copy it passively, that this surrender of the masculine quality of creating things has a quality of weakness, of passivity, of adaptation, which conceivably has something to do with this homosexual element," end quote. Rather than framing Warhol's silkscreens as an active process of selection, Arnheim instead declares it to be a surrender, a passive relationship to the world. He then implicitly connects this passivity in art to his queer sexuality. And let me quote him again. It's a really remarkable quote. "If you take the camera as a receptive organ, and if you use the camera as something which takes, which is impregnated by the world almost passively without doing anything about it, because you're taking whatever comes, you have a very passive quality in this use of the receptor instrument, don't you see?" End quote. Now, this is an absolutely remarkable collapse of the camera into a receptive organ, into, in short, of course, the promiscuously impregnable homosexual anus, characterizing Warhol's art at the very outset of his career. So powerful was Warhol's queerness circa 1962, when Arnheim gave this interview, that it superseded the self-evidently anti-biographical, non-self-identical quality of the work that you're seeing on the screen, with its parade of familiar supermarket commodities and advertising Coke bottles, Campbell's soup, and ads from the backs of comic strips. But what Warhol's campy pop mode coexists with another variant of pop, that contemporaneous third mode that seems to carry no such obvious camp inheritance. In a work such as the various supermarket boxes he made in 1963-64, Warhol seems to have other issues in mind. They are related, to be sure, since the ontological status of one kind of commodity destined for the supermarket is opposed to another destined for the art world, or the meaning of facsimile when the original, ostensible original, is itself merely a copy, but they do not, in the manner of his Marylands, betray a subculturally legible gay campiness. In turning to the rediscovered interview, we can secure a better sense of what Warhol himself understood as the import of the relationship between his sexuality and his art, for he says unambiguously, in a statement notable for the time, "I want that on my interview." Why is this? There it is. When they finally get down to business, they first play the relationship between pop and queerness for laughs. Swenson's strikingly frank question, do you think pop art's queer, comes off at first like a joke. But very quickly, as a familiar camp tone threatens to color the entire interview, Warhol does something very weird. He pushes back. More than that, he valiantly tries to redirect the conversation, and that is, for him, strikingly insistent in so doing. He deploys a string of negations, those no's, can't, it should be different. Such constructions are, of course, highly unusual in the context of Warhol's usual reflexive affirmation of everything. And what he is contesting, as you're about to discover, is the idea of gayness as the opposite of straightness. In place of this polarity, Warhol articulates a call for a universal polymorphous perversity, or what Warhol would rather articulate simply as liking.
Okay, well, let's start. What do you know about homosexuals? Any of you have that homosexual? Did your pen represent a penis? No, it can't be. I understand you are homosexual. It's specified homosexual. The crust is a middle class. No, it has to be on a different, it should be, different, it should be different, differently than, just sort of, different than direct. Yeah. Like,
Once he can get a word in edgewise amidst all this campy banter, Warhol's redirection turns on the obvious fact that not all pop artists are gay. And that it's not an artist's sexuality that makes pop queer, it's an attitude. What Warhol is trying to get at here so insistently is in fact a new idea about sexuality. It's contained in his twinned themes of liking and of machines, those two pillars of a generation of Warhol criticism. What Warhol is seeking to define is an automatic, reflexive, absolute, which is to say, machine-like way or process of liking. This is a form of liking that is automatic and unmediated. It refuses received opinion, what Swenson, in his brilliant 1966 essay, The Other Tradition, for his exhibition, referred to as evolutionary thinking. Evolutionary thinking, according to Swenson, is taxonomic, placing everything in its place in a preordained teleological trajectory. Swenson's target in that essay is formalist art history, with its easy judgments. But I think he gets this idea from Warhol and pop, likely from this very interview, with its notion of liking as an undoing of extant categories.
well, it can't be like that. It has to be, has to be sort of something that idea about, we all talk about art as homosexual. I mean, I'm saying that if all pop artists are non-homosexual, what does that have to do with being a machine? Well, I think everybody should like everybody. You should like both men and women. Yeah. Sexually and individually. And that's what pop art's about. Yeah. It's liking things. And liking things is being like a machine. Yeah. Well, because you do the same thing every time. You do the same thing over and over again. And you expect. Yeah. Everything you do. Yeah. And you just things up like these people. And you prove it. Yes. Because it's all fantasy.
Notably, here Warhol is trying out a very different vision of sexuality than the one that animated either his early board drawings or his campy pop. the very campy gossip his friends were then auditioning all around him. To like both men and women, sexually and in every other way, is to dislodge sexuality as a marker of social difference, and thus, of course, of social discrimination. This decidedly isn't bisexuality, as that remains a marker of identity associated with sexuality. Rather, what Warhol seems to be articulating is an automated, machine-like process of liking. This necessarily entails the abandonment of any extant model of sexuality where liking is motivated instead by desire or identity constructs. Such identity constructs can be understood, in Swenson's terms, as mere evolutionary thinking, a way of pigeonholing us into affinities we know in advance of any encounter. But resolutely anti-hierarchical, Warhol's sweeping affirmations are a vote in favor of a horizontal, not vertical social order. And that horizontal sociality turns on the valuation of surface over depth. For deep or felt liking segregates us, while machine liking flattens differences and causes us to pull together. Warhol's pop mode is a visual argument in favor of this widescreen approbation, figuring as it does a range of real-life products, people, and situations, sometimes deeply disturbing, as in the Disaster series, sometimes satisfying, but all notably resistant to clear definition. Warhol is here looking to promote an unmediated, automatic, in the moment of encounter that flees the demands for definition, that refutes the necessary classification of both us and that which we are looking at. Here, however, you can see the many cuts required to turn Warhol's very complex statement about sexuality into the famous impersonal claim that other critics write about. It can certainly seem that the new language of universal liking is itself premised on a set of other exclusions, be they Warhol's continued suppression of his Carpathian white working class Pittsburgh roots, his largely white social universe, or his patently obvious Madonna whore complex when it came to women. But, and this I can only gesture toward in my remaining time, this appeal to universality was also an urgent, contemporaneous impulse in the work of artists as disparate in gender, sexual, and ethnic terms as Carolee Schneemann, Yayoi Kusama, Ilio Otisika, Claes Oldenburg, all of whom, like Warhol, embraced a vision of undifferentiated collectivity as propounded in Herbert Marcuse's utopian fever dream, Eros and Civilization. As recent trans theory underscores, this non-binary universalizing opens up a whole new set of effective possibilities. But as gayness first began to politicize its difference from dominance culture, a minoritizing model, I hasten to add, that grew up in a context of overt discrimination, judicial terror, and mandatory self-denial as a means of negotiating homophobic horror, Warhol prescribes not coming out, but the very opposite, an anti-identity turn away from subjective death and classified desires. Yet the self-reifying coming out model of gay identity would, at the end of the decade, of course, become the very model of the gay liberation movement seized upon and subsequently ridden to great political success. And its central idea was that the world was divided between LGBT people and straight people in a clear and largely binary division. But here, long before gay liberation discourse was a political reality, Warhol is trying another tack. He's describing, I hope the point is obvious by now, what we mean when we use the word queer today. A marked refusal to consent to the notion that sexual desires constitute a meaningful field of difference. Rather than reinforcing an essentialized paradigm of his sexuality, Warhol's new model actually draws strength from the empirical fact that pop artists can actually not be gay. Warhol's new idea of sexuality is premised not on gay and lesbian difference, but rather on its concerted deliberate erasure. And pop art is exhibit A in that argument. Evidence that our manifold commonalities supersede and indeed swamp whatever residual differences we have, differences that we flatter ourselves as uniquely our own, despite the fact they are but the result of social scripts. But, and this is key, Warhol's de-essentializing queerness isn't the kind of generalized détournement that passes for queering in so much of the Academy today. It keeps its gayness fully intact and articulate. Yet Warhol's term for sexuality is liking. And he uses it, and as he uses it, liking is a political mode, a mode without discrimination in every sense of that term. In pointed contrast to gay constructs that define sexuality as something within a person, an aspect of their innermost core and character. In this model, liking isn't deep, essential, or individual, but automated like a machine, because that's what machines do, process things automatically without desire and without will. Conveniently, in its verb form, liking is an affective relation, but in its propositional form, liking is likeness, as in the notion of like with like, a recognition of analogic reasoning. Admittedly, this is a particularly queer kind of queer liberation, premised as it is on the elimination of sexuality itself as a field of meaningful differences, a newly consecrated social good to the degree that it eliminated the isolated, hierarchical, painful, or excluded nature of gayness. Warhol, what I'm trying to say, is that it suggests that the proper response to a homophobic world isn't to consecrate your differences, but to evaporate them, not by denying your sexuality, but rather by denying that sexuality is a meaningful aspect of any social difference. And yet the editors made of Warhol's frank conversation a mere pastiche of non-contiguous quotations intended to excise any discussion of sexuality. Though Warhol wanted his thoughts on homosexuality preserved in the interview, he didn't get his wish. They instead were carefully edited out, not by Swenson, but by the magazine's editor, Thomas Hess. In a subsequent interview, Swenson says to the artist Joe Raffaele, I asked Tom Hess if we couldn't, like you see in the interview I did with Andy, he cut up all those words. Raffaele says, oh, he did really? Swenson says, yeah. And is he going to do it again? Well, I don't know, Swenson replies, but this time I'm going to fight him. So when Warhol paints 210 Coke bottles in 1962, he is, as he would later write in his autobiography From A to B and Back Again, invoking this new vision of a brand new, undifferentiated communality, one premised not on difference, but on sameness, not on isolation, but on communion. Warhol wrote in that same book, you can be watching TV and see Coca-Cola and you know that the president drinks Coke. Liz Taylor drinks Coke. And just think you can drink Coke too. A Coke is a Coke and no amount of money can get you a better Coke than the one the bum on the corner is drinking. All the Cokes are the same and all the Cokes are good. Liz Taylor knows it, the president knows it, the bum knows it, and you know it. To argue that 210 Coke bottles is a queer painting, as I am now doing, is thus to redistribute the meaning and weight of sexuality from the individual to the collective and the communal, so close to our contemporary queer dream. In the Swenson interview, Warhol is trying to put into words this different framing of sexuality, one that is not dedicated to the establishment of its difference from dominant culture, but rather its contiguity with it. In his famous Paean to the Machine, Warhol was searching for a model of social engagement that kept individuality, interiority, identity, even taste at bay, that built bridges across our differences. But despite his manifest elevation of a reflexive, unmediated liking, Warhol himself continued nonetheless to be framed in terms of the very particularity of his gayness. As the critic Vivian Gornick wrote in her homophobic screed, Pop Goes Homosexual, It's a Queer Hand Stoking the Campfire, which was published in the Village Voice in 1966, right? Oops, there it goes. And I'm quoting it here, the most directly stunning result of Camp's influence is, of course, the raucous pop art vogue, which has probably set the course of American art back some 100 years or so. One has the feeling that it all started one day when a bunch of sweet young things got together after a mad, mad day at the decorators. In sarcastic imitation of the Mrs. Babbitts they serve, the boys began to whoop it up, painting the objects best fitted to describe Mrs. B's crass taste, end quote. So rather than seeing in Warhol's art a generalized cultural approbation, homophobes were instead branding the entire enterprise as but the mean-spirited revenge of gay shop boys and decorators. Its unabashed bashing, a chilling reminder of how the decks were stacked against an openly gay artist like Warhol in the 60s. Warhol knew that gay art, as they conceived of it, was a prison from which there was no escape, precisely because it was always going to remain a minoritized category. Still, Warhol's aggressive erasure of difference in favor of an unmarked vision of sexuality can only itself signify in a context in which gayness is already too visible. Absent that visibility, Warhol's queer dream of undifferentiated liking would be identical to homophobic erasure of sexual difference. Warhol thus holds on to his gayness even in the context of celebrating its elimination. And he holds the gayness he holds on to that gayness not only through his political statements and personal style, but through his continuing investment in the politics of camp. After all, what does it mean that when Warhol paints a Campbell's soup can with a torn label, he always, every single instance, divides the label between camp and belle? Camp becomes a seduction, a way to read something against the grain, if you're so inclined. Perhaps this is what Rosenberg meant when he said that you couldn't participate in American life except as a camp. Camp acknowledges that we're all acculturated in the same way, while also allowing for resistance within the terms of our domination, a demonstration that control cannot be absolute, that there exists the potential in any mode, no matter how dominant, to be turned against itself. But the only language we have for resisting culture is the same language through which that culture is written. Camp knows this and uses it. Camp builds alliances of the like-minded, a liking with a political purpose. As Rosenberg wrote in his prescient 1959 Death in the Wilderness, quote, "To keep a straight face has become an elementary health precaution," end quote. Now, when straight people needed to keep a straight face, it was queer artists like Warhol who could not only show them how, but offer a site of communion, a shared recognition of a deeply ironic approbation of our common culture. That's our challenge as we work to queer our history and culture. It's one thing to show an audience a recognizable gayness, one that resonates with all already existing thinking. It's another thing entirely to queer parasitically, a shifting construct that refutes, decenters, or tears apart any coherent vision of what queerness is or should be like. In queering, we need to be attentive to how queerness can and does escape the forms we readily recognize. To both like something and at the same time critique that liking isn't, I want to argue, a contradiction in terms. It's an acknowledgement instead of how we live. As Warhol once said, and I quote him, "The more you look at the exact same thing, the more the meaning goes away." That's the best definition of queer liberation I know. Thank you.
we spoke about the rest of the evening before, and we decided there will be a Q&A, but it will be communal and will involve drinks, both inside and outside. We have the building a little bit longer, we have the outside for even longer than that, but now that seems less appealing. And Jonathan will be around, and he told me, happy to talk.
Yeah, and I can stay up here for people who want to ask questions and stay in your seats. That's great. If you want to have a drink, go right ahead. I'll be wandering with the drinks later.
Oh, I misunderstood that. Okay.
Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, in that case, sorry, one second. I'll be right there. 1, 2.
Thank you for the very insightful talk. I'm just curious how you see the paintings, most of the paintings in this current show, with regard to the concept of machines and kind of that evaporation of sexuality, where these torsos and some of the very, very sexual paintings seem to be quite the opposite of that.
Absolutely. I see these paintings as helping Warhol frame his thinking about liking in machines. Because he did these paintings, and what he found is that nobody was interested in them, that they were only being shown at Serendipity, that it didn't advance his career, and that he couldn't be taken seriously. And so in many respects, what I think it taught him was that being this kind of obvious gay guy wasn't going to make it. But at the same time, he couldn't and didn't want to deny his queerness. And so he worked to invent a new form of understanding his sexuality, which was to accept and praise everything that came to the fore, because in so doing, the definition of difference was itself tamped down, and queer and straight became one. Anything else?
Right here. Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. I'm very interested in the idea of how, with this transformation and movement towards a more universal queerness, still the notion of gayness stays intact, as you said. If I got it correctly, there's at least 3 different strategies to do that. For example, quoting, referring to Kant, as in this example that you gave us here. The interview, for example, where he specifically talks about homosexuality, and also the notion of a universal sexuality as such. Is that how you think about the gayness as remaining intact?
Well, I think especially, though, that politically he needed to hold on to his obvious gayness in order to have the universal liking not appear simply as ignorance of difference. He needed to somehow be able to say, I'm gay as a goose, and I like everything. Because otherwise it has no political value. It just replicates dominant culture.
So, thank you for the astonishing, wonderful talk. Your talk pointed from Warhol to the future, towards the queer future of the 1990s in our own time. Is there, so as I was listening to it, I was hearing a different language, and a language very much from the mid-century straight world. It's the language of the family of man, it's the language of universal man, and I was wondering if you saw the connection between those worlds, and if so, what it might be.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think that one of the things that Warhol is picking up on is precisely a Cold War ideology, right, of we are all in this together, right, which had a clear political purpose in American life in the 1950s during the Cold War. I think that's absolutely right. But I think, as always with Warhol, that received ideas are inflected by questions of his sexuality. And as the interview makes clear, he is articulate about that fact. There's a question here.
Thank you. I'm kind of making up this question as I go along. Thank you for the talk. Something sort of sits with me, like what I like most about Andy Warhol's work, I think somehow is the melancholy, that that he represents a subject that's sort of completely ravaged by capitalism and somehow finds like some very expensive sort of triumph in that, and that everything is reified equally, you know, and that sexuality is just one of those things, alongside the electric chair or Liz Taylor or something. And I don't, it like all this thing about liking everything. It reminds me also of like the Tikkun's theory of the young girl. Like this kind of young girl is the ultimate subject of capitalism because she's completely washed over by it, and somehow that resembles this type of queer character that Andy Warhol also is. And I'm just wondering about. I've never understood his work as liberatory or emancipatory or empowering, like because I think that there is this deep melancholy about our relationship to capitalism.
Yeah, no, look, the way I would answer this is by saying that both are true. That there is absolutely a melancholic recognition that capital will overwrite everything. But equally, that in that overwriting, something liberatory can happen, because then we are all made equivalent. So I see the two as feeding each other. Does that make sense?
I didn't 100% understand the thing about the connection between gay and machine that you said once, and I was wondering if you could tell me that.
Sure. So what a machine does is operate without will, without intention, automatically, right? And what Warhol wants is a form of liking that is similarly absolute and automatic. And in developing this work, I should point out that I'm drawing a connection not only to Warhol, but to other early queer figures like John Cage, who similarly makes a kind of open acceptance of everything that happens part of what he values. All these figures are, I'm arguing, at the very moment that gay difference is becoming established, articulating a converse idea that gayness is the acceptance of everything. Make sense?
Resistance or protest? Or is it like go too far or that?
I think it doesn't go that far. I think that form assumes a position against dominant culture. And the thing that's striking about Warhol at this point for me is the widespread bring it all on, eat it all of modern culture, of liking everything and of accepting everything. You know, when he writes in A to B and Back Again, he does a series of descriptions of himself in the mirror, and they're not positive. He writes about himself in ways that the reader cringes on reading. And then you come to realize that each of those descriptions that he is describing in terms of what he sees in the mirror are journalists' accounts of him that have been published. And you come to understand that he's quoting others as the description of himself without judgment, without vanity. It's just bring it on.
Thank you for this amazing talk. I was going to ask about the death of the author, but I think I'd rather just make it more open and ask about disappearance, death in general, and like impermanence, because so much of his work seems impermanent, it seems set to disappear. Yeah.
Well, you know, death is a funny thing because at the moment of death, forms of identity and difference dissipate, and you become like everything else. you achieve what Freud called the oceanic feeling, although you're not conscious of that fact, right? So death is the moment when we cease individuation. And I think for Warhol, that moment is not necessarily a moment to be feared. And a lot of his thinking about death and writing about death seems to be sort of producing death as a spectator sport, just watching it happen. And while the people have said, and I don't think they're wrong in this, that Warhol was an unfeeling bastard, at the same time, I can see how it is of a piece with his larger idea of acceptance.
There's another question. So the language of machine and the subjectless desire, etc., is of course very Deleuzian. So in a certain sense, Warhol is a proto-Deleuzian artist in that sense. You also made a couple of comments about contemporary queer theory, and obviously contemporary queer theory has a lot to do with Deleuzian affect theory. Affect theory has substituted in certain ways queer theory in many contexts.
Yes.
I was wondering whether you can be a little bit more explicit in your commentary about contemporary queer theory, because it seems to me that you're using, if I understand it correctly, Warhol also is a critique of contemporary affect/queer theory. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it is a critique of that, because of course what that theory tends to do is reinforce or reify a notion of difference in the idea of affect, right? And what Warhol is much more interested in is a level playing field, where everybody responds exactly the same way. And I think we've lost the ability to understand the political power, and I really want to stress power, of a queer identification that actually eliminates differences, which so many of the artists of this period, I would argue queer artists, are engaged in.
And with that, should we
Sure.
continue to the next part of the evening? Oh. Okay. I saw an exhibition in Cologne by Roni Horn just a couple of weeks ago, and it seemed to me that she was, throughout her career, trying to disappear as an identity. And I was just wondering if you think this could be compared to Andy Warhol's idea of becoming completely fluid and liking things.
It's an interesting point. I mean, obviously the very difference is that Warhol is thinking of this at the very moment that gay identity is catalyzing as an identity, and she is, in some sense, a product of our post-gay moment, where queerness is broader as a social category. But I think the impulses are very similar. This idea that we can march behind our difference entails winning the battle but losing the war. And I think what Warhol intuited is that the best kind of liberation is a liberation from difference.